don't know if any of you, I don't know if any of you are using or have used Catch a Fire before, but that is an organization that's essentially what I call a clearinghouse for nonprofits to find volunteers. So if you type in Catch a Fire, all one word, .org, you'll go to their site. And this is where nonprofits post basically short-term opportunities to help out the organization. And I don't know how it works money-wise for the nonprofits, but the volunteers are volunteers. So I've done over 100 projects with these guys over the last 3 years. I have a skill set that's kind of unique, and I've been wanting in recent years to give back to the community. And this is a way to do it rather than just doing what a more blue collar type of volunteer, which is, again, I have a very specialized skill set. So for Catch a Fire, I've actually done 26 surveys for nonprofits. And also I've done the analysis on all those results. I've also been presented with 10 survey results, and I've done the analysis for that. So I'm a bit of a data geek, and this is sort of a little bit about my background. I started off in the Air Force as a computer programmer. For any of the old folk out here like me, if you ever saw the movie War Games, I was stationed at NORAD in Colorado Springs, and as a programmer. Eventually got into project management, and again continued my career mostly in technical fields or technical companies. During my time at Motorola, I went back to school to get my MBA from Kellogg, which is Northwestern's MBA program. And then I did a career shift at that time. I got into healthcare. So started off on the provider side, went into consulting for a while, and now I've been with Blue Cross Blue Shield of Illinois for the past 5 years. And actually, you guys are part of our network because I'm part of HCSC, Healthcare Services Corporation, which includes Blue Cross Blue Shield of Illinois, Texas, New Mexico, Oklahoma, and Montana. Why all those 5 states? I don't know, but that's what it is. So again, I've started off as a programmer, project management, and I morphed into something called Lean or Six Sigma. I don't know if you've ever heard those terms before, but basically they're process improvement techniques. So again, I'm very much have an analytical or data-driven bent. And so this is why I wanted to do something through Catch a Fire. Again, I find myself fortunate I found this organization to give back. So the other thing need to know about me, again, I'm an engineer. So this is a cartoon my wife gave to me a long time ago. So if you're anyone familiar with Dilbert, so he's sort of my patron saint. I relate to him quite a bit. So again, if I say anything that's a little quirky, I'm just chalk it up to being an engineer. All right, what are we going to do today? So talk about survey basics, some considerations, and surveying volunteers. So I think Alex did send out 2 links to surveys that here's what I consider basics for or core questions for doing something. Then I got permission from Gina to send you what the Habitat for Humanity in Tucson actually sent out. So you can see they're similar, but they're different. And along the way, then I'm going to dive deeper into the nuances of writing survey questions. This might be a little bit too technical, but there's some key things in there I think that's good to know, and then point to some additional resources. And since there's only a few folks on, please stop me at any point if you have questions and want to know things. Alex talked about survey rates. Typically, if you get somewhere in the high 20s, low 30s, you're doing great. So 10%, not so great. So again, we'll talk about different considerations along the way. All right, so again, the basics around why survey, you're basically trying to gain insights, hopefully which will provoke or evoke internal discussion, and then help inform you on your decisions and actions. And oh, by the way, you are going to get a copy of these slides afterwards, so don't feel like you have to furiously take notes. I will send these to Alex and he'll send them out to everybody. But also the other important thing about surveys is you want to create a baseline for future comparisons. Like, how do you know you improved if you don't have any baseline? So they're really important for creating baselines. That being said, if you survey, I'm a big proponent of following up as soon as possible. Because if you survey, think about the surveys you take. And if no one responds to you and tell you, well, what did you guys do with this information? The next time that organization tries to survey you, how likely are you going to respond unless they dangle some type of enticement in front of you? So that's why a lot of the times when I work with these nonprofits, I actually have a two-step approach with responses. One being almost like an immediate, once the survey is closed, providing thank you for responding to this. Here are some of the things you identified as strengths, and then take some time to look at the opportunities, and then maybe a few weeks later you respond with something that's saying, all right, here are the opportunities you've identified, here are things we're trying to do to take action. But then you rinse and repeat it. So that's the basic approach that I've done. Again, sort of the advantages of surveys, you can gather data from large samples. That can also be a disadvantage. I've analyzed surveys up to 1,600 responses one time, and that took a long time. And quantitative responses, so again, multiple choice, those are typically easy to do some type of statistical analysis on them. And the disadvantages, if you have a lot of open-ended questions or qualitative questions, those can be difficult to analyze when the sample size is large. So I mentioned the 1,600, the people who 1,600 people that responded to the one survey. It was poorly designed. They brought me in at the end and basically said, help. And so they had all these qualitative responses, and I was digging through all of those, trying to make sense of what the respondents were saying. Quantitative responses offer the impression of objectivity, and it's nuanced. As you saw the sample core questions, you see there's a lot of open-ended questions. I think that's where you really get the color and the actions as to what can be done, but it takes more time to analyze. So you got to figure out what the right balance of question is. So pros and cons about surveys. So that's pretty much the survey basics. Questions thus far, or I continue forward? Okay. Considerations. First of all, you got to have a purpose. So that's usually the first question I ask when I'm talking with nonprofits. What are you trying to get out of this? And what are you really trying to do? And because if you don't have a plan, you are going to just go all over the place, and it can be confusing for the survey taker. I'm sure you've taken surveys, like, what are they trying to get out of this? It's just not clear. Survey platform. So there's pros and cons that you need to consider. I am a big fan of SurveyMonkey. Actually, the paid version of SurveyMonkey, and versus other platforms. There's other more technical ones out there. Qualtrics is one that's used by a lot of companies, but that's big bucks to try to get that. And then Google Forms. I am not a fan of that whatsoever, because of what my second bullet point here is. You want to pick a platform that makes it easy to do the analysis. So of all the surveys I've done, I usually host the survey on SurveyMonkey, and then I'm able to download the data very easily into a spreadsheet, and then I can do my analysis from there. The one time I volunteered to do a survey analysis, so I had nothing to do with the survey design, they gave me the Google form. output, and it was all just words. There was no rhyme or reason to it. And so to organize that data took me a long time. And so that's why I'm a big fan of SurveyMonkey. The free version of SurveyMonkey works too, but it's their export functionality is not there. It's just basically a dump of text, and then you got to do all the sorting. So, but again, I'm a big fan of SurveyMonkey. I'm also an advocate of anonymous surveys. Why that? Because I think people don't feel threatened if you make it anonymous. And so I always try to suggest do it anonymously, but also if you saw my sample questions at the end, if you want to volunteer more information and you want to identify yourself, do so. And what does that enable? That then enables focus groups. So number of questions, again, fewer are always better. I just talked with a nonprofit that did a 99 question survey. I did not design that. I mean, they already designed it and they showed me the results. And I said, what was your drop-off rate? So there's data out there that shows the more questions you have, the higher or more likelihood the survey will be abandoned, which means it won't be finished. So usually when I introduce surveys, I usually have a word or a sentence says, this is an anonymous 7-question or 15-question survey. Just be very clear what it is up front as to what it is. Sort of talked about this already, types of questions, quantitative, qualitative. My bent is more towards qualitative. So again, I mentioned my project management background. When I finish up a project, I usually like to do something called a lessons learned exercise. And I typically ask 3 questions. What are 1 to 3 things that went well at the project? 1 to 3 things that didn't go well or could have gone better? And any surprises along the way. And those are all open-ended questions. And I have to do all the analysis, but I get something a lot more rich from that as far as on the positive side of the ledger, things I can replicate. And on the negative side of the ledger, things I can address to try to fix. So also, you need to consider the organization's willingness to take action. If you are going to survey someone, hopefully someone's going to take action with it. If you, again, goes back to there's follow-up and feedback. There have been organizations I worked with where yeah, we'll do something with this. And then we get to the end, they're like, thank you very much. And that was it. So you got to gauge how willing you are to take action. And I mentioned before about follow-ups. So initial is a follow-up thanks, where I emphasize the positives, and then a subsequent one where I address opportunities. And so here you have, this is actually the example from Habitat for Humanity Tucson, where this is the note that was sent out after the survey, within a couple of days after the survey was closed. So again, highlights. I already gone through all the analysis and all the things, and I said, all right, here are the 4 things that showed up as strengths. So, I mean, you can read them here. Then I usually kick out a sample quote to give some context to it. So again, the first one, altruism. Again, the example is the great joy I get from helping others. So again, just try to provide some examples. And when people see their own feedback in there, that reinforces that they want to do it again. And then these are my typical next 3 steps. Analyze the responses to figure out what needs to be addressed, reviews proposed measures with leadership, and then for anything that's approved, we then clearly communicate with you. And then if there's any type of incentive tied to it, this is where you also announce that too. So obviously for the Habitat for Humanity in Tucson, they did do some type of raffle. Questions thus far?
A quick question for you, or maybe 2. The first is, and maybe this is outside of the scope of this, but I've never heard of a net promoter score. Is that something you're familiar with?
You are a good lead setup guy because that's like 4 slides from now.
Great. And then secondly, these these like quotes that you're pulling out, are those coming from like open-ended qualitative?
Yes.
Cool. Okay, great.
So I pull out something that I believe is representative.
Yep. So you kind of find the themes that are like represented, and like
Right.
if 15 people responded and you see altruism kind of popping up enough times.
Right. So I organize all the comments and then I put them into buckets. So
I see.
that
Cool.
sounds time consuming. It is. But
Uh-huh.
otherwise, if you just looked at all the comments, you would figure, well, what am I reading? So I
Yep.
try to help it by organizing everything into a different order.
Awesome. Yeah, that's really helpful. I was curious to know how you kind of go about pulling out the kind of important info in the qualitative data. So thank you. I appreciate that.
Sure. Any other questions? All right. Here's the second follow-up. Now, this obviously is not Habitat for Humanity. I pulled this from one of my work examples. And this is, I'm working with nurses a lot. So there were 3 major categories, one around workflow, one around communication, one around system issues. And in there, we actually write, this is the major theme, and this is exactly what we're doing or what we have done to address it. So again, it's a 2-step follow-up. And I see Alex trying to get closer to the screen. Again, I'll send all this out. The point being is it's being very descriptive without writing War and Peace as to what we're doing with your feedback. So it shows that you're actually listening. So I try to advocate for this. Sometimes people do it, sometimes people don't, but when I control the survey, this is something I do. All right. So that was survey considerations. So surveying volunteers. So the core questions, demographics, but the question I always ask is, what does this tell you? So I think with Gina, we went over, I think they really wanted a lot of demographic questions. And I'm like, how are you using this? How are you going to slice the data to say, all right, this is actionable? And eventually we got down to a fewer number of demographic questions, but you got to figure out, how does this help provide insight? So again, core questions: overall satisfaction with the org. What are 1 to 3 things you like best? 1 or 2, 3 things that can be improved upon. Why 3? If you leave it open, what are things that you like best? You might get 1 or 2 volunteers that write everything that crosses their mind. So I just say 1 to 3. And for volunteers, I think this is something that's provide some insight. Did you learn anything from this? And then here we're going to talk about the net promoter score. How likely is that you're going to recommend the org to a friend or colleague? And do you plan on volunteering again? And then any other comments. So that's the core right there. But if you use the anonymous survey, here's the chance to grab additional information. And if you want to bribe them, here's the chance to introduce the bribe. So this is what I normally do as far as the core questions. So if I go out to SurveyMonkey, and again, this is what my SurveyMonkey dashboard looks like to me. But if I go to the example, oh, this is Habitat for Humanity. So, nope, I'm sorry, this is not. This is the one that I've redacted. So this is another program I worked with where their demographics is the zip code and how did you hear about us? And then level of satisfaction with different parameters, overall sat, things you like best, things to prove upon, something you learn from the experience. Would I work with these guys again, or how it will likely? This is the Net Promoter Score question, and I plan on volunteering again. So this is the core question. And if I go to Habitat, you are going to see they asked a lot more questions on demographics. So they asked 6 questions on demographics, but then they fell into the same pattern about looking at your experience, overall SAT. I use a lot of these types of questions. Please indicate your level of agreement with the following. If you ask yes, no questions, those aren't really actionable. So I usually do the strongly agree to strongly disagree scale. Like best, could be improved, learn anything, and then the various bribe. So most of the organizations, I try to keep them in the low teens. I've had some organizations that, we know we want to ask all these 33 questions. And so I go with it. It just takes a lot longer to analyze. But I think I keep on trying to say, what action will this question drive? And if I don't get a good answer, I just keep on pushing them to say, you got to make sure this is crisp and concise, so actually people will take it. All right, any questions about the core questions?
I had a quick question. I was just curious, if there is drop off within the survey, do you generally use what they answered, or do you throw out the ones that they did answer?
So with SurveyMonkey, I don't have the Uber version, so I can't tell who's dropped. So, but I also, the other design technique is you can make certain questions mandatory, and I don't typically make questions mandatory. So to your point, I can see a response where they just answer a few things, but they're able to get to the end. So if you make things mandatory, that's also a turnoff for a number of survey respondents.
Thank you.
Sure.
That's helpful to know, because I'm often a fan of the mandatory button. So that's actually really interesting. A quick question I had was, and maybe you'll get to this with like data analysis, but what types of, like on that strongly agree to strongly disagree kind of scale, what kinds of statistics or like data analysis might you do with that kind of stuff, with those kind of data?
So let me pull up something.
I also love data, so I'm very intrigued.
So this is one of the surveys I did with one of the nursing groups nearly 2 years ago. So what I do with the results, I look at several things. In this case, this is some basic high-level questions, but here I'm working with the care management group and the utilization management group. And so blue is strongly agree, red is strongly disagree. So I'm looking at 8 dimensions with this question, all about the environment for continuous improvement. And here I'm looking at, what are the favorable, the positive responses. So you can see here for this question, all critical processes are documented. There's a lot of agreement going on here. And this box that you see is I'm comparing and contrasting care management and utilization management. And so I'm looking at, are they primarily doing a favorable response or unfavorable response? And how strong is it? And so pretty much there's all favorable responses here. The only difference, I mean, this sort of stood out to me. This started moving a little bit towards less. You have more red here. And including this one right here, my department is open to change. So I'm looking for sort of trends and what's going on. Does that help?
Yeah, that's amazing to see it, to see how you plot it out and how you pull conclusions from the way that you organize the data in a graphic, in a visual format. Thank you.
Yeah, and let me show you one more thing. So if I was to show you the raw feedback I get, it's just one continuous blob. But what I do is I take all those comments and I one by one, I like, what does this mean? And I put it into a category. And then as I do this, this theme emerged the most. This theme emerged second most, and so on. So this is the feedback I provide to whomever I'm helping so that they can digest it in a more reasonable manner than just looking at everything blobbed together. So
Wow. Amazing.
so
This is amazing.
this does take time.
Yeah. Oh, I can't even imagine. Thank you so much.
Sure. All right, here's Net Promoter Score, or NPS. So, and you've probably taken surveys where they may not have used the term Net Promoter Score, but on a scale from 0 to 10, would you recommend? That's the Net Promoter Score. Well, what does it mean? So it ranges from -100 to 100. So basically, it's the promoter score versus minus the tractor score, and to get your overall thing. So what this is right here, so it's 80% minus 6%. That's how you get to the 74. So promoters are those, they're going to promote the organization. It's just going to be really, really good. The detractors are the ones that are going to start spreading bad information about you guys, and you want to figure out either how to move them from this phase to this phase or just get rid of them. So I've had some discussions with, and they know who these people are. I'm like, why, let's encourage them to move on rather than trying, or if you can't move them to passive, figure out how to remove them because they're hurting your organization. So here's the real definition. I mean, the further definitions around here. Passive are they're satisfied, but they're really unenthusiastic, and they may go switching to another competitive offering. And then the people, the detractors, the ones that are really going to try to make your life miserable. So I hope Gina doesn't mind. Let me find it. Actually, I took their Net Promoter Score, so it is very high. So, and I think that's great. This is actually a very good Net Promoter Score. So you have a lot of people that are supporting the organization. I've done one survey where all the feedback is positive, 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 and the Net Promoter Score is negative. I'm like, well, what happens is you get a lot of people sitting in this passive. And I don't know about you, but when I take a survey, you got to really knock it out of the park for me to give you a 9 or 10. So there's some of that dynamics going on versus, some people, I would typically, if I really enjoy something, okay, it's 8, that's good. Unless it really, really rocks my boat. But I fall into this passive thing, even though I can advocate for it. So there's, again, this is not an exact science, but it's directional. If anything, it's directional. All right, let me Make sure I close the correct one. All right, did that help answer Net Promoter Score? Okay.
I have a question about that. If you are having anonymous surveys, which you strongly recommend, how do you work on converting the detractors? Because sometimes it's just like a communication issue and people might not be likely to recommend because their previous staff person was a jerk or there was a misunderstanding, or it could be remedied. But how do you find out who that is when you follow up? Like if the survey is anonymous, how do you reach the people that were negative in that question?
Well, there's two ways. One is you look at what are things that can be improved with the organization. If you see a strong theme emerge, you can address that, and that usually helps move people along. The example I gave before, the person that gave these negative, these very low scores, they self-identified later on. They wanted to provide additional feedback. So I mean, it's sometimes people self-identify, and then I'm not really happy. So that's the way I would do it. And if they don't self-identify, I would really look at what can we do to help improve the organization. Does that help, or is that just muddy the water further?
Yeah, I think so. Thank you.
Okay. All right. You know, but I want to ask more questions. So I just figure out how many take it. So one trick is you design the survey and then you give it to your spouse, your best friend, whomever, and say, all right, can you take this and tell me what you think of it? Just get another set of eyes on it rather than just saying, all right, we're going to go with it. Because if you try to survey for everything, you end up really not learning anything. So that goes back into having a plan and a purpose as to what exactly you want to do. All right, now this is going to get a little bit more specific about some of the nuances about writing survey questions. So when you get this, you're going to see this source right here. So this is where the source I took it from, and I verified it's still a good source. So this is actually this from this part on, I've actually given this to MBA students before. So this type of recommendations how to design surveys. So all these 6 major categories, we're going to talk a little bit about that, specific examples around that. All right, relevance. All right, you've already heard me say this. You got to have a plan. If you, so you can back into a plan, you can forward thinking, whatever you need to do to come up with an overall objective, and that's what's important. And also, you got to figure out what you're trying to measure. You know, attitudes, behavior, intentions, perception. They're not all the same thing. So when you design the survey, you got to make sure, I try to say it's focused on one group. There's no harm in surveying multiple times with the same group, but you need to demonstrate that you're actually taking action with that feedback. So survey 1, we're going to try to measure this. Okay, based upon this, we already know we want to do survey number 2. But what can we do to show this group we're trying to move forward? Who's my audience? We've talked about that, and what kind of statistics do I want? I already mentioned about testing the survey. Again, you just want to make it easy for the people to take this. Don't make it so difficult. Question structure. So use appropriate scales. So this top one, it allows what I call fence sitting. You see this neutral dude right here? I am not a fan of neutral. So I try to get people to on one side of the fence to the other. So I usually do something like this, and strongly disagree to strongly agree, or some form of that. So you might have heard of the Likert scale before. So that's basically those types of questions that I show, it's basically a form of a liker type question. Also, you want to figure out when you design your questions, what is my survey results going to look like? So in my case, as I design the questions, I'm trying to figure out what am I going to actually produce at the other end. SurveyMonkey actually generates a lot of reports. I'm not a fan of them. So actually I download the data in Excel, I create my own charts for the quantitative data, and I go from there. So the example charts I showed before with the graphs, I did that all in Excel. Be consistent with your scales, don't confuse them. Another big thing is allow for not applicable. So a lot of my stuff has a lot of non-applicable at the end, just because it may not apply. Not big, again, not big on neutral, not big on not sure, NA, or this. So again, I try to ask things in statements rather than yes or no questions. All right, this is a biggie, and I've seen this quite a bit in surveys I've taken where they used unbalanced scales. They skew the answers to either a positive or negative bent. So what does that mean? So less than expected obviously is negative, as expected is neutral, more than expected, consistently more, 2 positive. So you have 1 negative, 1 neutral, 2 positive. That's unbalanced. So what is balance? Consistently less, as, more, consistently more. That's a balanced scale. Similarly, with my agree to disagree questions, unbalanced, 1 disagree, 1 neutral, and now you have 3 positives. I've taken surveys before when they had that, and when that happens, I just exit the survey. I'm just not going to take it anymore. Balanced, 2 on the disagree side, 2 on the agree side, and 1 neutral. So this is actually a big point. Questions on this, because this is you're trying to put objectivity in the survey as much as you can, and this is a big deal. All right, try to avoid asking unnecessary questions. If you ask somebody their date of birth, you don't need to ask them the age. You can compute that. If you ask somebody their zip code, you don't need to ask for their city and state. You can figure that out. I donate platelets on a regular basis, blood platelets. Actually, I'm getting close to my 100th donation on platelets. So they always ask when I do the questionnaire, were you born in the United States? Well, yes, I was born in the United States. And how many times I have to answer that? I mean, the answer is never going to change. So things that you can find out other ways, like if you have a volunteer database and you sort of know where everyone's from, ask yourself, do I really need to ask the demographics of these questions? So figure out the other sources of data you have, and just don't ask unnecessary questions. All right. Don't use one-dimensional questions. So use one-dimensional questions. So this is the statement I have here is an example of a poorly worded question. Anybody like to venture a guess as to why this is a poorly worded question? It tries to cover multiple dimensions. This word right here, and. The better way, 2 questions. So that is a better way to do it. Limit the use of open-ended questions. So you've been hearing me say, use open-ended questions. Yes, but again, don't get crazy with it because you got to analyze the data. All right, answer choices should be mutually exclusive. So an example of something that's not mutually exclusive is, what did you eat for breakfast? Pancakes, waffles, and omelet. Well, that's not really, there's other things you can choose. What about the bagels, or the eggs or whatever? So here's another example that's better, but it has broad categories. So we've also got to be careful of overlap. If I'm 20 years old, which one do I select? So that's an easy trap to fall into. You want to provide enough options to capture about 85% of the responses. When you do multiple choice questions or checkbox questions, you don't have to capture everything. That's why there's this other box usually you can put in to capture all the miscellaneous stuff. So you don't have to go bananas. Because I've seen something that has some surveys that have like 30 choices to pick from. And that's not really helpful. What are the major ones? What are the most key ones we typically see? Then put another box down there. I just talked to this. So, and also I've seen surveys where you look at the responses, and of course, this one answer is going to get 80% of the responses. That's not informative. That doesn't help you make a decision. So you want to make sure there's balance on that too. You know, the KISS principle, keep the question simple. You know, this is too complex versus, you know, what is your preference for bathroom lighting? Again, I've mentioned already, try to keep everything clear and concise, not open to multiple interpretations. Obviously be brief and try to be as specific as possible. So questions about structure. Okay. Objectivity. Try to avoid using the weasel words, you know, like often, sometimes, usually. Well, what does that mean? So you try to use very precise terms that can't be subject to a lot of interpretation. Avoiding leading questions, like this is a leading question. Would you agree that our customer service is excellent? So, so you could actually ask a form of this question. Our customer service is excellent. It's a statement. Strongly agree to strongly disagree. You can ask it that way, but when you ask, would you agree? That's a yes or no answer. So that's why I like using the statement approach and then having the strongly agree to strongly disagree type of statements. This is a neat feature of SurveyMonkey, and I don't know about the other platforms, but you can randomize what the respondent is seeing. So say this is what these are the dimensions I want to measure. For one respondent, it will go out this way. For the next respondent, it will be presented that way. Why would you want to do that? Well, you're trying to avoid bias in the available answers. Like if someone just says, oh, the first one's there, boom. So in this case, now it's moved down here. So you can randomize different things. So I actually think if I go back to the Tucson survey, I did employ some randomization in some of the responses so that it wouldn't just be the first one that they see. Look and feel. Again, I already talked about minimizing use of those words. Acronyms, jargon, and slang, if they're familiar with the group, that's fine, but you got to be careful on using so many terms like that. And this is this article's recommendation about showing progress bars and make it easy to go back and edit. I try to design the survey so they come in and they get out. It's a 7-question survey, you know, go in and do it. Or sometimes I say it will take 10 minutes to do the survey. So SurveyMonkey can actually tell you how long it will approximately take to do the survey. Already mentioned question clarity, flow. So I already mentioned some of the research has been done on this. that if it should take less than 5 minutes to take. If it takes 6 to 10 is acceptable, but then if you anything longer than that, remember the 99 question survey, you're gonna drop it off. So this is a good heuristic or rule of thumb. Typically 5 closed-end questions can be answered per minute. So that's the quantitative questions, and 2 open-ended questions per minute. So that's just a rule of thumb. So again, back to basics about flow. I have some type of introduction. I ask the important questions early. I try to group related questions. And my preference is to put demographic questions at the end, but usually I'm overruled and they want the demographic questions first. So, because to me, they're not the most important questions. So you had, Mariah, about your question earlier about, people dropping. If I have all these demographic questions, I'm like, oh, I'm exhausted, and they drop. But what the real meat of the question was the last few couple of questions. Put those up top. So, all right. Questions about guidelines. Again, I gave you a lot of information to think about there, but those are hopefully some things that will help you as you design future surveys. Which brings us to additional resources. I will forward this article to you. And again, if you did Google designing surveys for volunteers, you'll get a lot of good ideas there too. So questions?
One question that comes to mind is what does it look like when people go about trying to think about like what they want their survey to answer, like the purpose of it? Because for example, I was kind of trying to think about when I was working at the food bank, like what would be the purpose or question of a survey? And there were like, it's such a cloud of possibilities that it could be trying to answer. What does that process kind of look like in your experience when people are trying to suss out the purpose of a survey?
Well, usually to me, it's an interactive series of questions.
Okay.
Back to, what do you hope to change? What is your top concern? And eventually, if you get answers to questions like that, you can sort of reverse engineer as to what the purpose should be. So I've talked with a number of the nonprofits, and they really didn't know what they wanted to get out of it. And so I just asked a series of questions about where is the group, in their emotional journey. Maturity stages, as far as how mature the group is. What are some of the things that, people really say they like about it? What are some of the things you've heard that be improvement? And again, eventually I can back into some type of survey.
That is a very helpful process. Thank you.
Sure.
I was going to say, I really love the idea of having the demographics at the bottom. I've never thought about that before. It's just always in my head as the first question. But with that logic, where do you usually place qualitative questions or like the open-ended ones? Is it just wherever they group together? Or I feel like those are usually at the end for most surveys.
Right. So my recommendation was originally to shove all these demographics at the bottom. And then start with your experience. How was your experience? And then, so basically take these 6 questions, shove them to the bottom and start right here. That would be my recommendation, because here I am. It's question 7 before I'm starting to get to the meat. And and so in SurveyMonkey, part of the discussion I had was, what questions do you want? Mandatory, again, I usually recommend none of them be mandatory, except maybe this question right here, overall satisfaction. So you can see a star here. SurveyMonkey, that means mandatory. They also wanted this about experience to be mandatory. And these statements right here. I think that was it. Oh, the MPS question, they wanted mandatory too. So I realize I gave you more information than what you asked for, but what I would not do is I would not intersperse demographic questions through the survey. So you see sort of my style here is I label titles, demographics. Okay, now I'm talking about your experience. And then, so I try to put different categories in there.
Thank you. That was really helpful. And it was nice to see how they were laid out with the categories. I don't think I've ever included categories in this survey before.
Okay.
I second that. Yeah, this is all, yeah. This is all, it's really revealing to me the level of which my like surveys that I've created are at and where they could be at. Yeah, this is incredibly useful. Thank you.
Sure. And I think that's it. Any other questions or this is the nurse survey. Since we have a little extra time, let me bring this back up again. So this is what you saw, their survey questions. This is what their results look like. So they actually had a low response rate. But here, this is why I asked when they wanted to have a department question, what are you hoping to do with this information? Because you can see it's a lot of it is in the construction side. And then, your volunteer time frame. What am I trying to learn from this? Half of them are relatively new, half of them are older. So here's another one. We have all these different age buckets down here, but this is the predominant answer. And then how'd you hear about us? So of the canned answer, that wasn't the bigger one. The bigger one was the other. And so I just listed all the feedback. Here's the zip code. What are you going to do with this information? I don't know. But here's the happiness with the staff. So the way I typically do this is I put the strongest response top and then go down to the weaker responses. This overall is great. I mean, look at this. This is outstanding. I mean, dark green all the way up here. That's just an outstanding response rate. So I said, this is very, very good for you guys. Then I put, they had some comments, so I've embedded some of those. Overall satisfaction, this is outstanding. So for that organization, it's just part of the thing for them is the low response rate. So how do you address that? You address some of the opportunities for improvement. So this is where, again, then when I got to this about things that are strengths, this is where I put in major themes. I put in other themes that I saw, improvement opportunities, major themes here. So typically, if you want to really figure out what to do, you try to pick out 1 or 2 or 3 nuggets out of this and say, this is something that if we improve, we're going to help shift, what the volunteers think of us. MPS score. So in their case, 11 people responded with wanting to provide information, and I mentioned focus groups. So to me, this is a prime candidate to create a focus group. So a focus group, basically, with the way I run focus groups is I usually give them a brief overview. This is what the survey results said, but you raised your hand. So what do you want to share with me? And I try to get everyone involved. Would I have a survey focus group with 11 people? No, that's too much. You're going to have 1 or 2. Typically, if you bring in that many people, there's one or two personalities that are just going to dominate the conversation. So I try to keep it to 5, because then I can do better crowd control. And then if someone says they want to volunteer information and they clam up, I have no problem. Again, I taught, so cold calling. Hey, so and so, what would you like to add to this? So you got to figure out what a reasonable number is for a focus group. So so that's what their survey was. And again, very positive net promoter score, but just a low response rate, and that's probably what they needed to figure out what to do next to help improve.
Yeah, that's phenomenal. And yeah, deeply, deeply relevant to almost any organization I've ever been at. And I've not seen surveys organized this well or using these types of methods before. And I
Right.
really think it would make I think it would begin to make a difference in like how we respond to and develop and improve upon our.
All right. So I will leave those links open for 4 more weeks. So if somebody wants to go out there and just, I mean, even if they respond to it, it doesn't make a difference. I mean, I'll collect the responses, but it's easy to me to see that versus a PDF printout of it, or just a list of questions in a Word document. So to me, the look and feel is important. And I'll send you the PDF
Thank
of
you.
the PowerPoint presentation.
Yeah, I'll share that with folks who didn't get a chance to be here.
Okay. All right. If there's any other questions, I'm only an email away. And if nothing else, appreciate you inviting me.
Thank you very much, Jack. This was awesome.
All right.
Thank you, Jack.
Enjoy the rest of your summer.
Likewise. Thank you.
All right. Bye-bye.
Bye.